President Taraki had an apparently devoted prime minister, Hafizullah Amin. Amin was the regime's strongman. In spite of the unrest, he was determined to drive on with the reforms. Amin launched a campaign of terror. He had opponents arrested and shot.
I said to Amin that his policies were too harsh, that they were turning the Muslim population against him, like the land reforms which did not take into account Afghan traditions. But he used to reply, "Did Stalin make the revolution in white gloves?"
Afghan President Taraki flew to Moscow to discuss with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev how to curb Amin's excesses. They decided to oust him, hoping the Kabul government could get popular support by slowing the reforms and ending the terror. Moscow's secret plans leaked out. When President Taraki returned to Kabul, Amin had him seized and executed. Amin realized the Soviets wanted him out. He began to seek better ties with the West. The KGB even imagined Amin might be a CIA agent.
Andropov, the head of the KGB, became very concerned about Amin flirting with the Americans. Andropov felt that if we didn't introduce Soviet troops, Amin would claim that Moscow hadn't fulfilled its obligations. He would then turn to the Americans for help, and they would put their own troops in.
In Moscow, the arguments were mounting in favor of using an invasion to remove Amin. In the past, Soviet military action to topple troublesome foreign leaders had worked in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In Europe, the nuclear arms race was gathering speed. NATO wanted to counter the Soviet Union's mobile missiles. On December the 12th, 1979, the West announced it would deploy hundreds of cruise missiles in response. Moscow now felt it had little to lose internationally by intervening in Afghanistan with troops. That evening, the Politburo held an emergency meeting.
Our major concern was the security of the southern borders of the Soviet Union. We also feared the spread of Islamic fundamentalism into Afghanistan from Iran.
I said that military intervention in Afghanistan would be very difficult for our army. It would not necessarily lead to success. One only has to consider the conditions in Afghanistan, its geography, its history, and especially the independent nature of the Afghans.
We also felt that if we didn't go into Afghanistan, then some other countries would. The intervention of these states could destabilize the situation on the Soviet-Afghan border and in the region as a whole.
The Politburo took its fateful decision. By December 25th, 1979, tens of thousands of men in tanks and trucks started to trundle across the border. Moscow hoped they could complete their mission within weeks. The old royal palace on the edge of Kabul was Prime Minister Amin's favorite residence. KGB special forces stormed the building. Amin tried to hide, but they shot him dead. Moscow replaced Amin with a more manageable leader, Babrak Karmal. Since the Cold War started, the Soviet Union had never invaded a country beyond the borders of the Warsaw Pact. Now, Soviet forces were stepping across the line.
the implications of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan could pose the most serious threat to the peace since the Second World War. The vast majority of nations on earth have condemned this latest Soviet attempt to extend its colonial domination of others. I had to put restraints on the Soviet Union. One of them was to issue a public statement that if the Soviets did invade either Pakistan or Iran or Iran out of Afghanistan, that I would consider this a personal threat to the security of the United States of America, and I would take whatever action I desired or considered appropriate to respond, and I let it be known that this would not exclude a nuclear reaction.
The military intervention of the Soviet Union cannot be justified. There can be no question of any country other than the Soviet Union having interfered in Afghanistan's internal affairs.
At the United Nations, the Soviet invasion was widely condemned. President Carter blocked grain deliveries to the Soviet Union, launched a boycott of the Olympic Games in Moscow, and stepped up U.S. spending on arms. Détente was over. U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis would be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as is possible.
Do we know whether any Soviet units have reached these border posts?
No.
They're holding back.
They are holding back.
We started providing weapons to the Mujahideen from various sources again. Some, for example, some Soviet arms from the Egyptians and the Chinese. We even got Soviet arms from the Czechoslovak communist government, since it was obviously susceptible to material incentives. And at some point, we started buying arms for the Mujahideen from the Soviet army in Afghanistan, because that army was increasingly corrupt.
Brzezinski sought the help of General Zia al-Haq, Pakistan's military ruler. Pakistan always had a keen interest in Afghanistan. Pakistan wanted a friendly and strongly Islamic neighbor. The U.S. Congress had earlier cut U.S. military aid to Pakistan. General Zia had a bad human rights record. He was developing a nuclear bomb. He had failed to curb drugs trading. Now, the Americans set aside their displeasure.
I think we had a double standard with respect to the Pakistanis, and we knew that there were big problems with drugs and that there were big problems with nukes, and we were prepared in various ways, in any way that we had to turn Nelson's eye to those problems, as long as the Afghan resistance was being supported via the government of Pakistan, and that's what we did.
In Afghanistan, the Red Army guarded cities, roads and airports, leaving the Afghan army free for combat. By 1980, almost 100,000 Soviet troops would be deployed around the country. It was a civil war, but many of the Soviet conscripts were told they were coming to Afghanistan to confront Americans.
Ну и начались такие разговоры разные. Откуда